Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you, Ytharth. Thank you, all the participants of this whole enterprise. I'm really happy and proud to come and talk to you. You know, that I've seen your website, it's very lively, very young. And I wish that, you could continue in the months and years to come. As someone who is also running a website for the last 11 years, I know it's not easy. So once again, congratulations. If you can, anything I can be of some help to you in any form, don't hesitate. The first, the title. You said post Netanyahu. What do you mean by post? If you look at it, you can say post Narasimha Rao. But unfortunately, whatever Narasimha Rao did is not post. It is still there. So the consequences of his actions are still there. Whatever Narasimha Rao did in 5 years ago till 96. The same thing. Whatever Netanyahu did, good or bad, will be there for at least the next couple of decades, if not more. So the question is, we need to look at what he did and how that is going to affect in today's Israel and Middle East or even tomorrow. Netanyahu is a colorful person. The most common description of him is he speaks English like an American and Hebrew like a Sabra. He can speak both with absolute ease. There are no Israeli politician who can be a better communicator than Netanyahu. And Netanyahu has dominated the Israeli political scene for 4 decades. He was a business person. He studied in the MIT and all of them. But his entry into politics began in 82 when he was made the deputy chief of mission in Washington, when Moshe Aarons was the Israel's ambassador. And, and when Moshe Aarons came to Israel after finishing his term in New York, Netanyahu becomes the Israel's ambassador in New York to the United Nations. Then he comes to Israel, 1988, becomes a deputy foreign minister. It is in that capacity he was the spokesperson of Israel during the Scud attacks. As Israel was facing the Scud from Saddam Hussein, he was coming to the television and he was comforting people in enormous ease. And that's why he became the public face of Israeli diplomacy. Then he goes to the Madrid conference. Even though the prime minister is going, he was going as the spokesperson. But when Rabin becomes a prime minister, when the party was in shambles, Netanyahu walks in. Actually, you can see them. When the mood of the Likud campus, where the campaign headquarters was very low, suddenly Netanyahu walks in. He was an orator. So he inspires, they know they lost the election, but still he inspires. So it takes over the leadership in 94 and becomes a prime minister in 96. When he lost the election, he took a leave. He took 2 years of absence, went to the United States and became a public speaker and made a couple of millions in the process and came back to Israel and took over the party leadership. In other words, and he became the leader of the party in 2005, once again, when Likud was in crisis. When Ariel Sharon broke the party and left for form a new government, the party was in shambles. Once again, Netanyahu comes back and builds the party. And the rest, as Abhishek was saying, he was the longest serving prime minister for 15 years. If you include the 3 years in 90s and 12 years now, he has the longest serving prime minister. And he has been able to influence Israeli society beyond recognition. That is something we need to be very careful. We normally talk about Netanyahu within the context of peace. He opposed the Oslo process. When Yitzhak Rabin was signing the Washington Agreement, Netanyahu exactly at the same time organized a parallel anti-Oslo ceremony in Jerusalem. He tried to delegitimize Oslo for the 4 years. And if you remember, in some of the anti-Oslo protests, people were carrying pictures of Yitzhak Rabin in SS uniform. You know, in Israel, to have a SS uniform is almost infuriating. And one such poster was found next to Netanyahu when he was speaking. Netanyahu says he didn't notice it. And Netanyahu, to some extent, he was not inciting the population, but he was tacitly accepting it. He did not rein in. And if you look at the Israeli domestic situation in 95, when Rabin was killed, a lot of people directly or indirectly held Netanyahu for creating that inciting atmosphere. But once he becomes the prime minister, he was compelled to deal with Arafat. There was no other way out. But then he was not willing to accept Oslo as Rabin did. So 3 years, whatever was possible, he tried to derail the process. So when we talk about Netanyahu, you have to talk about his contribution in somewhat derailing the Oslo process. From 93 to 96, when Netanyahu was carrying out the anti-Oslo process, Hamas was doing exactly the same thing in the Palestinian territories. You know, you have a very great ironic situation. Netanyahu was trying to undermine Oslo inside Israel. Hamas was trying to undermine Oslo inside the Palestinian Authority. Hamas was trying to do through suicide bombing, and Netanyahu was trying to do through political delegitimization. It's a very interesting to watch. But the problem was with the Labour Party. The Labour Party said, we need to make peace with the Palestinians, we need to make an agreement with the Palestinian for peace. But in reality, more Israelis were killed after Oslo than before. It was not PEACE, it is PIECE. That is what happening on the streets of Jerusalem. Between 93 to 96, one of the first things me and my wife did when they reached your office was to call home and to say, I'm arrived in one piece. There was no guarantee that people will come back home alive. We were then in about a dozen places, either before or after a suicide bombing took place, physical. On 2 occasions, I canceled my trip in the last minute. Once I was supposed to go to Tel Aviv. The other occasion I was supposed to go to university. I normally take the very first bus, 6:30, because it takes about 13 minutes. If you take a late bus, it takes an hour. So normally I take the first bus. On both the occasions, the bus I was supposed to take blew up. So when we talk terror, it is not some statistics, some remote 3,000 miles away. It is exactly immediate, you know. So that is what happening from 93 to 96. So in some ways, Netanyahu and Hamas were almost working for the same goal of destroying the Oslo. And he was successful in that. But the Labour Party also was not able to prepare the people. And that is why if you look at Labour Party today, there is a single digit. There are only 7 seats, which is better than last time. Last time they got 3 seats. A party which dominated Israel was completely decimated, largely because you are not able to follow an effective peace policy. And that is why Netanyahu comes to power. But when Netanyahu comes to power in the first time, he was, I would say, little inexperienced. He was only a deputy minister. He never had a cabinet position. So therefore, it took some time for him to adjust to the Israeli coalition politics. And people used to call him, in Delhi, all the drivers never follow the lane. It's a zigzag. So in Israel, they used to call him zigzag prime minister. He will move from one to the other simply because he wants to save the day. And he became unpopular and he lost the elections. And if you look at it, Barak was there only for 2 years. He won the election in 91, he lost it in 2002. But in 2000 itself, he lost. In 2001, February, he lost the election. But Ariel Sharon, who came to power, decided to break the party, once again plunged Likud into a crisis. And Netanyahu survived all these years. And if you look at it, for the last 12 years when he was prime minister, there was very little negotiations with the Palestinians. So,
please mute yourself, whoever it is. Please mute yourself.
Shiba, I think she's speaking. Okay. So what is happening is, in 12 years of time, nothing was happening in the peace process. And it also saw the Fatah and Hamas total division. And Netanyahu's refusal to take part in the negotiations largely brought the Israeli-Palestinian talk to a halt. But in spite of that, you see that the Israeli-Palestinian violence, the last major one was 2014. And that did not endure much. And from 2014 to 2021, Netanyahu managed to keep the peace intact, in the sense without any major violence. But Netanyahu's contribution to the Israeli society or polity should not be confined only to the peace process. If you do that, you will not understand. You think that Netanyahu is done, so it's a new Israel. No. He made enormous changes in the economy. Likud is committed to economic reforms, lesser government intervention, and more competitiveness. He actually broke the monopoly of the banks. He privatized them. He created what he would call level playing field. There is an enormous competition. And therefore, when much of the world was talking about economic crisis, Israeli economy was growing. And that is one of the reasons Netanyahu was continued to be popular till the very end. There is no. So when you are talking today, post Netanyahu, you have to talk about Netanyahu's accomplishment in the economic realm. Look at the politics. You criticize Netanyahu. No negotiation with the Palestinians. You brought peace to the end, everything. But look at Israel's interest. US recognizes Golan as an Israeli territory. US recognizes Jerusalem as a capital. If you look at Jerusalem, no American government recognized West Jerusalem as Israel's capital. We are talking about 1948. From 48 to 67, West Jerusalem was Israeli. Even that was not considered Israel's capital. But Trump, thanks to Netanyahu-Trump equation, he recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And they moved the capital, American embassy, to Jerusalem. And if you look at Biden administration, they are saying we will not move any of these measures back. That is, we will not reverse the actions of the Trump administration. So whether Netanyahu is there or not, all the gains of Netanyahu will be there. And if you go a step further, Abraham Accord, the normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab countries, it tells you two things. At one level, there are diplomatic relations between Israel and countries like Bahrain, Emirates, Sudan, and Morocco. And you and I know Bahrain and Emirates will not normalize relations with Israel without the tacit support of Saudi Arabia. That is a precondition. We know that. So Saudi Arabia is on board. And the second thing is the normalization is happening when there is no progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front. And Palestinians screamed and everything. And finally, they recognize, okay, Emirate will follow the national interest of Emirates. And today, they are talking about cyber security cooperation. And if you look at Emirates and Israel, there is one thing which is common. Both are efficient people. It's not like in India, you promise something, don't deliver till everything goes. No. Emirate will promise and Israel deliver. Israel will promise and deliver. So you are going to watch an enormous cooperation between Emirates and Israel on education, cybersecurity, high-tech, industry, aviation, innovation, you name it. All the cutting-edge technology, both are going to be partnering. And this is happening when there is no progress on the Palestinian front. In simple English, the normalization of relations between Israel and the Gulf countries tells you it is no longer an Arab-Israeli conflict. It is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Once again, this is, people are talking about it for the last 30 years. People actually said since 67, this is the situation. And if you look at it, after 74, there is no war between Israel and an Arab state. But under Netanyahu's watch, it becomes a reality. And whoever comes to power, irrespective of the ideology, political party composition, they are going to take the benefits of it. They are not, no, this is Netanyahu's policy, let me reverse it. No. Not in Washington, not in Israel. So when we say post-Netanyahu, it is not post-Netanyahu. You are going to see, even after Netanyahu leaves office, you will see the gains of all these issues. Economic reforms, political reforms, and on top of it, he puts the Iran on the agenda. You can question the way in which Netanyahu handled the Iran fight. But the bottom line is simple. Israel sees Iran as a major threat. Existential threat may not be the appropriate word, but it's a severe threat. And no government can actually change that. The manner in which you can change the policy, you express your opposition may be different. You may be more sophisticated, more nuanced, less belligerent, less confrontationist, or probably you will convey the message through back channels. But Iran as a threat is real, and no matter which government comes to power. Now, after the Bennett government comes, what has changed? Okay, Bennett went to Emirates. I'm sure Netanyahu also would have gone there. If you remember, Netanyahu was supposed to be in Saudi Arabia and met the crown prince before the normalization. So he has been traveling all the places. More importantly, under Netanyahu, since nothing was happening on the Palestinian front, foreign policy or a foreign ministry was more active in cultivating other countries. India, Korea, China, Japan, Africa. If you look at all these countries, the relations between these countries and the leaders and Israel improved under Netanyahu. Partly because he was not spending too much time on the Palestinian front. Because the Palestinian front takes more time, less results. So Netanyahu said, nothing is happening. Let me not waste my time on that. Let me spend my time. And that is why, I don't know how many of you are familiar. In September 2019, during the election campaign, he used Prime Minister Modi's poster in the election campaign. He used only 3 leaders. Trump, because of US is very important. Vladimir Putin, because Israel has about 1 million Soviet Russian-speaking immigrants in the country. And the third leader he used was Prime Minister Modi. I was stunned. How many votes he will get because of playing Modi? But then I recognized he was communicating a message. Israel is not isolated. The global leaders, whoever is important, are friends of Israel. And that was the message he's communicating by using Prime Minister Modi in the election campaign. So he has expanded the reach, which the next government will harvest. You know, everybody talks about the current coalition government, which for the first time has an Arab political party. In Israel, you never had an Arab party as a legitimate member of the coalition partner. The closest thing you ever had was in 1992 to 96, during Rabin Peres government, the Arab parties were providing outside support to the government. That is the only occasion you had some. But now, the Arab parties are member of the coalition, and the leader of the party is a deputy minister in the prime minister's office. This has never happened. But then, when you look at how did this happen, and look at the speech of Prime Minister Bennett, when he was introducing the cabinet, Bennett was saying, the Ram party has joined the coalition, and our coalition is diversified and stable because of the Ram party, but we are grateful to the role played by Netanyahu in getting Ram into the coalition. Netanyahu also wanted the same Islamic movement. He met them so many times. Some of the meetings actually took place in the prime minister's residence. 1 or 2 meetings took place during Ramzan. And therefore, during Ramadan, the meeting took place, and the leader, Muhammad Abbas, could not or did not eat or drink anything during the meeting. So Netanyahu also was he's a very sophisticated guy. And he also respected him, and he hosted them during Ramzan. So these meetings which broke the political barrier. And that is why Ram was able to come on board. And the most important thing is, in the election, in the Knesset, there are 120 seats. Likud is the largest party with 30 seats. And they could actually, they are the real bloc. They could break the coalition whenever it suits them. And the Likud has a track record. Likud may be very hostile, angry, opposite, very rhetorical. Sometimes they also take a anti-Arab rhetorics. But the party is more disciplined. They don't unnecessarily challenge the leader. I'll give you one example. After the founder of revisionism, Jabotinsky, passed away, Menachem Begin takes over the leadership in late 1930s. If you take that as a starting point, say, even if you say 1948 when Israel was created, from 1948 till today, the Likud had only 4 leaders. Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, and Netanyahu. If you compare to the Labour Party, from 1969, when the Unified Labour Party was established, till today, they had 12 leaders. A number of them, they went and came back. If you include them as a separate one, the number is even larger. So the Likud has a greater cohesion, greater internal discipline. But that is also a bad news. Because Likud did not see any other leader than this one. As we have said, from 92 till today, Netanyahu was the dominant Likud personality. Before that, he was a diplomat, but he was a dominant personality. So, who after Netanyahu? That would be a major challenge to the Likud party. So the party will always find leaders. It's not that you cannot. But whoever comes to power will be a smaller person, even internally. Netanyahu is a global figure. He has established personal rapport because he was there for the last 30 years. And whoever comes to power, whoever takes the leadership will be a much smaller person internally, therefore less known externally. But otherwise, a number of problems facing Netanyahu will continue. It will not change. Whether it is a question of Iran nuclear deal, whether it's a question of the threat from Hamas, whether it's a question of Fatah-Hamas disunity and negotiations, none of the things will change. But only problem is, Netanyahu had a very good cohesion with the right wing and the religious parties. Therefore, he was able to concentrate more on external foreign policy issues. This will not be the case under the new government. Because if you see the coalition, it is 60-59 in the Knesset vote. Or it is 61-59. But even there, a lot of people are still, I will not support this, I will not support that. There are a lot of internal tensions around. Which means your attention will be mostly concentrated on survival. How the coalition survives. We actually exactly a month, they reasonably survived with all the support. But the survival would be the prime concern. Which means that the ability to resolve bigger problems are limited. If you look at the extension of the marriage law, it actually failed simply because the opposition were united. Even though the opposition wanted the law, they want to embarrass the government. That's the only reason they voted against the law, not because they were against the law per se. So it is going to be focusing more on that. And the Likud still thinks that even though there are competition, Netanyahu is a dominant figure. Netanyahu's popularity may be a problem when the corruption scandal takes over. He has been tried for corruption for the last 4 years. And if you look at in Israeli context, the amount of money in one of the cases is about $200,000. If you look at $200,000 in India, it looks very huge amount. But if you look at an Israeli case, $200,000 is probably 6 or 7 months' salary. It's not as significant in monetary terms, but it is significant in political terms. Israel is the only country which is willing to take the law in the serious sense of the word. No one is above law. And that is why the former president went to jail, the former prime minister went to jail, couple of former ministers went to jail on corruption charges or sexual harassment case. That was the case for the president, which basically means Israel tries to establish what you and I would call rule of law. It is in that context you should look at Netanyahu's trial, not because, oh, he's a corrupt guy. No. If you look at the corruption as a criteria, most of the Middle Eastern guys should be in jail. You can actually have a cabinet in jail. But in all these countries, you get away with it. Corruption is not an issue. You are the law, not the law is under the ruler, not the ruler is above the law type. The law is not supreme, the ruler is supreme. So that was the context in which it is done. So if you look at in broad context, Netanyahu might have left the office You might have left the Balfour Street, but its influence is very much there, not only in politics, but also in the economic realm and also in the foreign policy realm. The challenges that Netanyahu faced are very much there. So it is in a number of ways, they have to improvise on Netanyahu's policies. You cannot simply say, I'm going to give an alternative. That means that no, you're renouncing Golan Heights. No, American embassy can go back to Tel Aviv. That is what the alternative would mean. So I don't think that Israel is what, even though, in the 1970s, there was an article in EPW. It ran something like that. Foggy bottom, go home, but take me with you. If I had to say today, Uncle Sam, go home, but take me with you. More or less, that's exactly the situation. So while you criticize Netanyahu endlessly, very quietly, whether it is the coalition partner having a Islamic party as a partner, or having a visit to Emirate by the foreign minister, or forging ties with Washington, or reaping the economic benefits of COVID and all of them, Israel, at least for quite some time, will reap the benefits of Netanyahu long after he left the office. I will stop at this point of time. I'm more than happy to answer any questions, comments you would like to say.